On October 22, 1936, a half dozen science fiction fans came down from New York by train to Philadelphia for the first intercity meeting. This picture, taken of the group at Independence Hall, has appeared in a number of histories of science fiction fandom. This may be the first science fiction convention. Among the attendees from New York, Frederik Pohl and Donald A. Wollheim. A couple years later, this New York group founded the Futurian Society in 1938. It was started by 13 science fiction fans, and it never numbered more than 20, including wives, girlfriends, and hangers-on. From this small group came 7 of the most famous names in science fiction: Isaac Asimov, James Blish, Damon Knight, Cyril Kornbluth, Judith Merrill, Frederik Pohl, and Donald A. Wollheim. If you're interested in learning more about the Futurians, you could look at The Way the Future Was, a memoir by Frederik Pohl, or Damon Knight's account of the Futurians. Why am I talking about the early history of science fiction fandom? Well, recently I discovered and collected a series of books by Avon, science fiction of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. The editors? Damon Knight for the first one, Frederik Pohl for the second one, and Frederik Pohl is included in the introduction to the third one. Who better to document these eras than those who lived through it themselves? Welcome to Vintage SF. I'm Richard Rempel. Today we're going to take a look at these 3 books. Let's take a look at the first one, the one that inspired the rest of the series. Science Fiction of the 30s by Damon Knight. At the top it says, "There isn't a science fiction personality in the business as noted for his good judgment with respect to SF literature as Damon Knight. Any anthology he edits is bound to be good, and it is a pleasure to have him turn to the exciting decade of the 30s for one." That's by Isaac Asimov. Now we're going to talk about a number of the features in this book, including the introductions by Damon Knight and also the art from the original magazines that they were first published in. Reading from the back of the book. These 18 stories, works by John W. Campbell Jr., Lester Del Rey, L. Sprague de Camp, Eric Frank Russell, and other early masters of the genre, have long been out of print, available only to owners of the original magazines and special collections in which they have appeared. Accompanying the stories themselves are the rare illustrations from those original magazines. Commentary by Damon Knight provides an insider's view of the circumstances under which they were created and the special rivalries that existed among the publishers, the editors, and the writers. Looking at the table of contents, we have a foreword by Damon Knight, and then he talks about the early years in Part 1. Authors that we find in this section are Robert H. Wilson, Murray Leinster, Frank K. Kelly, and John W. Campbell Jr., who would later go on to be the editor of Astounding Magazine before the end of the 30s. The middle period. Writers included are Howard W. Graham, Ph.D., David H. Keller, M.D., Frank Belknap Long, Jr., Stanley G. Weinbaum, Raymond Z. Galoon, Harry Bates, A. McFadden, Jr., and W. K. Soneman. And the end of the 1930s, we have stories by Eric Frank Russell and Leslie T. Johnson, L. Sprague de Camp, Manly W. Wellman, and Lester Del Rey. To conclude the book, we have a bibliography. Damon Knight's introduction to each of the 3 sections of the book are quite informative. And then we have the art before each story. I wish more anthologies included the art from the original magazines. Science Fiction of the 40s. The works of Isaac Asimov, James Blish, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, C. M. Kornbluth, Murray Leinster, Clifford D. Simak, A. E. Van Vogt, and many other masters of the genre are brought together here, many for the first time, in a collection of classics offering a rare vision of an exciting era in science fiction. Here are not only the best stories of that marvelous decade, but also an insider's view into the years and the brilliant, flamboyant personalities and publications which saw SF rise from a fledgling literature to a gleaming, fantastic art. This book has an introduction by Frederik Pohl, but also note that it's edited by Frederik Pohl, Martin Harry Greenberg, and Joseph Olander. The table of contents. The introduction by Frederik Pohl, and then we have stories by Raymond Z. Galoon, Isaac Asimov, Nelson S. Bond, C.M. Kornbluth, Lester Del Rey, Murray Leinster, Lee Brackett, C.L. Moore, Cleve Cartmill, Clifford D. Simak, Frederick Brown, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, Theodore Sturgeon, Chandler Davis, Robert A. Heinlein, James Blish and Damon Knight, Henry Kuttner, Judith Merrill, William Tenn, and A. E. Van Vogt. A selected bibliography wraps up the book. Now in this book we do not have illustrations, but we do have an introduction to each of the stories. These are marvelous and formative introductions, telling us about the author and the time in which it was written. Taking a look at the last story in the book, Dear Pen Pal, written by A. E. Van Vogt. A. E. Van Vogt burst upon the science fiction scene with Black Destroyer in 1939 and continued to electrify readers throughout the 40s until he ran into a notion called Dianetics, which brought his writing career to a crashing halt. He recovered, but he never recovered his previous brilliance. Often a difficult read, his works featured at least the possibility of many layers of meaning. But even if his readers did not always follow his convoluted plots, they felt the attraction of the power of his ideas. In some respects, he was the 40s version of Philip K. Dick. The decade was enriched by his novel Slan, 1946, a landmark among mutation stories, The Weapon Makers, 1946, later revised, and The World of Null A, 1948, a strange mixture of power and confusion. Dear Pen Pal shows that he could be cute as well as complex, employing a story form somewhat unique to science fiction. And this story was found in The Arkan Sample, 1949. Science fiction of the 50s, a defiant decade's greatest stories. The works of Alfred Bester, Algis Budrys, Fritz Leiber, Catherine MacLean, Barry N. Malzberg, Robert Sheckley, Margaret St. Clair, Theodore Sturgeon, William Tenn, Jack Vance, and many other masters of the genre are brought together here in a diversified and dynamic collection of classic stories that not only raise science fiction to new standards of style and character, but also offer brilliant insights into a decade of optimism and disillusionment. The 50s were a decade of fear and promise, of witch hunts and phenomenal technological growth, turning both a piercing critical eye and an entertaining sense of humor and hope toward those years. These stories tell the fantastic dreams of yesterday and offer prophetic visions of tomorrow. Note that although it has a preface by Frederik Pohl, it is edited and has introductions by Martin Harry Greenberg and Joseph Olander. Perhaps that's Allander. The table of contents. There we see that preface by Frederik Pohl. The introduction by the editors, and then the authors. John D. MacDonald, Catherine MacLean, Chris Neville, Frederick Brown and Mac Reynolds, Mark Clifton, Jack Vance, William Tenn, Fritz Leiber, Theodore Sturgeon, Robert Abernathy, Alfred Bester, Margaret St. Clair, Robert Sheckley, Algis Budrys, Frederik Pohl, James Blish, Damon Knight, C.M. Kornbluth, A. Bertram Chandler, Pohl Anderson, Chan Davis, and Barry N. Malzberg. Once again, a selected bibliography completes the book. This time the dual editors write the introductions to the stories. Taking a look at the story 5,271,009 by Alfred Bester. Although his first science fiction story, The Broken Axiom, was published in Thrilling Wonder Stories in 1939, Alfred Bester was one of the most important writers of the 50s. His two novels of that decade, The Demolished Man, 1952, and The Stars My Destination, 1956, became instant classics. The former book, one of the first skillfully executed psychological science fiction works to come out of the genre. Bester was also an important critic of the field as a reviewer for the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, a man with few illusions concerning what he felt to be the limits and failures of most of the science fiction produced at that time. He was one of the pioneer dropouts from the field, but one who has come back home. This story is from the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, March 1954. So this series, which was published in the late 1970s, finished with the science fiction of the 1950s. It would be interesting to see if they had continued on with the 1960s and 70s. If you happen to see any of these books in the used bookstore, you may want to pick them up. I look forward to reading the introductions to these stories as well as the stories themselves. Until next time, keep reading.